The Restless Spirit, a horror story. Hello friends, welcome to the horror ghost stories. The story begins. It was a stormy evening when Evelyn arrived at the old mansion. Her car had broken down miles from civilization, and she was stranded on a narrow road leading up to an imposing estate, half hidden by overgrown ivy and ancient oak trees. She had no choice but to seek shelter, and the mansion, though dilapidated, appeared to be her only hope. The faded sign at the front gate read, "Greystone Manor," its letters barely visible against the darkening sky. As she approached the front door, Evelyn felt an inexplicable chill. The air felt heavy, thick with the weight of something unseen, like the house itself was watching her. She rang the doorbell, which let out a loud, eerie chime. Moments later, the door creaked open, revealing an elderly woman, her face lined with years of sorrow. "Can I help you, dear?" the woman asked in a voice that was both kind and hollow. "I'm stranded," Evelyn explained. "My car broke down, and I saw your house. I was hoping to wait out the storm here." The woman nodded slowly. "You're welcome to stay for the night. But be warned, Greystone Manor is not a place for the faint of heart." Evelyn, though uneasy, had no other option but to accept. She stepped inside, the air even colder in the dimly lit hallway. The woman led her to a guest room at the far end of the mansion. As Evelyn stepped inside, she noticed the room was oddly pristine, as if it had been frozen in time, untouched for decades. "Rest here," the woman said softly. "But remember, don't wander the halls after dark." Confused but too tired to question her further, Evelyn thanked the woman and closed the door. She sat by the window, watching the storm rage outside, the wind howling through the trees like a symphony of anguish. That night, sleep didn't come easily. Evelyn kept hearing strange noises, faint whispers, and dragging sounds from somewhere deep within the mansion. But each time she tried to investigate, she found nothing but silence and darkness. Suddenly, the room grew colder, so much colder. The temperature dropped so dramatically that Evelyn's breath formed visible clouds in the air. She was about to pull the blanket closer when a shadow moved across the far corner of the room. At first, she thought it was just her eyes playing tricks on her, but then the figure moved again. A woman, dressed in a tattered white gown, her hair wild and unkempt, standing by the window, staring out into the storm. Evelyn froze, her heart pounding. She tried to call out, but her voice caught in her throat. The woman's head slowly turned towards Evelyn, her eyes empty sockets, as if the very life had been sucked out of her. "Help me," the woman whispered, her voice a raspy breath. Before Evelyn could react, the figure disappeared into the thin air, leaving only the haunting echo of her voice behind. The next morning, Evelyn was shaken, her mind struggling to piece together what had happened. The storm had passed, but the mansion felt even more oppressive than before. She couldn't shake the image of the woman from last night. Who was she and why did she look so dead? Determined to uncover the truth, Evelyn ventured downstairs. She found the elderly woman in the kitchen, preparing breakfast. "You were right," Evelyn said, trying to sound casual. "Last night, I saw something in my room. A woman. She was standing by the window." The elderly woman's face paled, and she dropped the dish she was holding. It shattered on the floor, but she didn't seem to notice. Her eyes grew wide, and her voice trembled. "Did she speak to you?" the woman asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Evelyn nodded. She said, "Help me." The old woman collapsed into a chair, her hands shaking. "That's impossible," she muttered. "She should be gone. After all these years, how can it be?" Evelyn was stunned. Who is she? What happened to her? The woman hesitated, looking as if she had aged a decade in an instant. Her name was Eleanor. She lived here with her family decades ago. But she was murdered. Murdered? Evelyn asked, her heart sinking. "Yes," the woman said, her voice breaking. "Her own father killed her." The house was full of secrets, dark ones. Eleanor had discovered something her father had done, and he couldn't let her expose it. So, he killed her and hid her body somewhere within this house. Evelyn's mind reeled. But why does she still haunt the house? The woman looked away, as though afraid of the answer. Because her spirit is restless. She can't move on until she finds peace, until she uncovers the truth of her death. Evelyn couldn't let go of the mystery. She needed to know more about Eleanor's death, and if there was a way to help her spirit find peace. She spent the day searching the mansion, going from room to room, hoping to find a clue, a sign that could explain the restless haunting. It wasn't until the evening, as the sun began to set, that Evelyn discovered a hidden door in the library. It was tucked behind a massive bookshelf, almost impossible to see unless you knew exactly where to look. She pushed the bookshelf aside, revealing a dark staircase leading down into the basement. With a sense of dread, Evelyn descended into the darkness. The air was thick with dust and decay. She stumbled over old furniture and broken glass, but there, in the far corner of the basement, she saw it, a small, wooden chest, half buried under a pile of old blankets. Her heart raced as she approached. She opened the chest, and inside, she found a collection of old letters, photographs, and a blood-stained knife. The letters were dated from the years leading up to Eleanor's death. They told a story of betrayal, lies, and the horrific truth about her father's dark deeds. Evelyn read the last letter aloud, the words haunting her, "I know what you've done, Father. And I will expose you, no matter the cost. You can't silence me. I will make sure the world knows the truth before it's too late." Evelyn gasped as she realized what had happened. Eleanor had discovered that her father had been involved in terrible crimes, but before she could expose him, he murdered her to keep her silent. Her spirit, unable to find peace, had been trapped in the mansion, forced to replay her final moments over and over again. That night, as the clock struck midnight, Evelyn found herself back in her room, the air cold once more. The whispers began again, louder this time, almost frantic. The figure of Eleanor appeared, her eyes empty, her form flickering like a dying flame. "You found the truth," Eleanor whispered, her voice breaking through the cold silence. "But it's too late for me. My father's legacy lives on, and I will never rest until he is exposed." Evelyn knew what she had to do. She returned to the library and grabbed the letters, the photographs, and the knife. She made her way to the old woman. "I know what happened," Evelyn said, her voice trembling. "I found the truth. Eleanor's father killed her. She needs to be free." The old woman nodded, her eyes filled with sorrow. "You must show the world the truth. Only then will her spirit find peace." With the proof in hand, Evelyn took the evidence to the authorities the next morning. The story spread like wildfire. Eleanor's father, once a respected man in the community, was exposed for his crimes, his dark past revealed to the world. That night, as Evelyn prepared to leave the mansion, she heard one last whisper. It was faint, but it was there. "Thank you." The house, once dark and oppressive, seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. The oppressive weight lifted, and for the first time, Evelyn felt as though the mansion was no longer haunted. Eleanor's restless spirit had finally found peace. And as Evelyn drove away from Greystone Manor, she couldn't help but glance back at the house. It stood silent in the fading light, a place of secrets now laid bare. Days passed since Evelyn had left Greystone Manor behind, but she could not shake the feeling that something was still with her. She had done what she could to bring peace to Eleanor's spirit, but as she went through her daily routine, she felt an unsettling presence lingering around her. It was as if the mansion was still reaching out, not through the spirit of Eleanor, but something darker, something that had been quietly watching her from the shadows. It started with little things. At night, Evelyn would hear soft tapping on her window, as though someone was knocking from the outside. But when she opened it, there was no one there. Her reflection in mirrors began to shift, subtle movements that she could never fully make sense of. Sometimes, when she passed through dark hallways in her apartment, she felt a cold gust of air behind her, a whisper just beyond the edge of hearing. She told herself it was nothing, a trick of the mind, the aftermath of the trauma she had endured in the mansion. But it wasn't long before the whispers turned into something more insistent. One evening, as Evelyn sat at her desk working, she felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. She turned around and, for the briefest moment, saw a shadow flicker across the far wall. It was not Eleanor's form, but something else, tall, with long, thin arms. The figure seemed to stretch impossibly tall before fading into the dark, leaving Evelyn breathless, her heart racing. By the time she had convinced herself to call a therapist, it was too late. The haunting wasn't just in her mind. It was physical, real. The next morning, she awoke to find all the lights in her apartment flickering wildly, then going out one by one. The air was thick and stifling, and she could feel the presence more clearly now, a presence that was not benign. Evelyn's life began to unravel. She couldn't concentrate at work, her sleep was plagued by nightmares of the mansion, and no matter how many times she tried to escape the feeling, the sense of being watched only grew stronger. One evening, as she walked home, she felt an undeniable pull to a place she hadn't thought of since she had left, Greystone Manor. The mansion stood tall and ominous under the moonlit sky. No longer did it seem like the place of dark secrets, it felt like something alive, something that had been waiting. Evelyn couldn't help herself. She drove toward the house, her hands shaking on the steering wheel as if some force beyond her control was guiding her. The storm clouds had gathered once again, and the wind howled as she pulled into the long driveway. As she stepped out of the car, a familiar chill swept over her. She was no longer alone. The front door was ajar, just as she had found it that first night, and despite every rational thought urging her to turn back, she walked into the house. It felt wrong. The air was colder than it had ever been. The walls seemed to groan under the weight of some invisible pressure, as if the house was alive, watching her. "Eleanor," Evelyn called out, but her voice faltered in the silence. No answer came. But something was different. As she ventured deeper into the mansion, she felt the weight of something dark, something malicious, waiting for her in the shadows. The moment she stepped into the grand hallway, the lights flickered and then died, plunging her into darkness. A low, guttural sound vibrated through the floor, like something was stirring beneath the house. Evelyn's breath hitched as she felt a cold hand brush against her shoulder. "Help me." The voice, not Eleanor's, but something else, something twisted and ancient, whispered in her ear. It was barely a sound, more of a feeling, a vibration that struck her to her core. "Who are you?" Evelyn whispered, her body trembling. The darkness seemed to respond. The air grew thick, almost suffocating. From the corner of her eye, Evelyn saw something move. A figure. Taller than human, with limbs unnaturally long and fingers twisted like claws. The shadows seemed to wrap around it, as if it were one with the very fabric of the house. She backed away, but it was no use. The creature loomed closer, its form becoming clearer. It was the father, Eleanor's father. But he was no longer the man he had once been. His body was twisted, deformed, as though the very house had consumed him, turning him into something monstrous. His eyes were voids, empty of life, and his mouth stretched into a grotesque smile that seemed to stretch beyond what was possible. "You think you've freed her?" the creature growled, its voice deep and rumbling. "She was never the true prisoner. I was." Evelyn tried to run, but the house twisted, the walls shifting in ways that made no sense. The windows were no longer windows, they were walls. The doors led to rooms that didn't exist, and the floors creaked and groaned beneath her as if the house itself was coming alive, trapping her in its labyrinth. Desperation set in as Evelyn ran, but every corner she turned brought her face to face with the monstrous form of Eleanor's father. He had become the embodiment of the house's curse, a thing trapped between life and death, a tormented soul whose evil would never be extinguished. The truth was worse than she had imagined. Eleanor's death had not only been murder, it had been the catalyst for a deeper curse, a darkness that had consumed both father and daughter. She stumbled into the library, the only place she hadn't yet explored. The moment she entered, the whispers became deafening. And then, in the middle of the room, she saw it, a book on the pedestal, glowing with a faint, unnatural light. She rushed forward, her hands trembling as she opened the book. Inside were strange symbols, ancient and cryptic. The pages seemed to pulse with energy, and Evelyn realized it was no ordinary book, it was the source of the house's dark power. Eleanor's father had used it to imprison his own soul, binding it to the house so he could never be caught, never be punished. The darkness had fed on him, twisting him into the nightmare that stalked the mansion. With no time to lose, Evelyn ripped the pages from the book, the air growing colder with each page she tore. The floor beneath her shook as if the house itself was in agony. As the final page ripped free, a sudden, blinding light filled the room. The figure of Eleanor's father shrieked, his monstrous form flickering and collapsing into a cloud of shadows. The house groaned, the very foundation shaking, and then, as suddenly as it had all begun, everything went silent. The darkness that had filled the mansion dissipated, and for the first time in ages, the air felt still. Evelyn collapsed to her knees, the weight of the ordeal crushing her. But then, in the stillness, she heard a soft voice. "Thank you." Evelyn looked up. There, standing before her, was Eleanor. Her form was now peaceful, her eyes no longer hollow, but filled with a gentle light. The torment that had plagued her spirit was gone. With a final, grateful smile, Eleanor faded into the light, her spirit finally free. As the dawn broke outside, Evelyn stood up, her body aching and exhausted but filled with a sense of resolution. She had broken the curse. Greystone Manor would no longer be a place of darkness, but a house of peace, its twisted history finally put to rest. And as she left the mansion behind for the last time, Evelyn could feel the weight of its oppressive presence lifting from her. The house, once a place of death and sorrow, would no longer haunt her. The restless spirits had been set free. The end.